Welcome back, everyone, to another great episode we have today, one that I've been looking forward to for a while in our Free Speech Forward podcast, because today we have David Bernstein, one of the top leaders of the Institute for Liberal Values, to talk with us about his ideas and perspective about the importance of free speech. If you've been a listener or a viewer of our show, you probably know this whole project is a co-sponsorship between 1776 Forward, which is the organization that my co-host Chris here and I have put together, where we're leading the revolution, fighting for the future of freedom and flourishing. And we're doing this in partnership with ILV. So it's great for us to have David with us here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris and we'll learn more about David.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. And hi, David. Great to have you.
Great to be with you.
For just briefly, for all of our listeners, a little bit of background on David. He is a passionate advocate of the free expression of ideas. He's the president and founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and the past president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, as well as the former executive director of the David Project. He's also the author of Woke Anti-Semitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. So without further ado, we usually like to just start off by letting you, our guest, tell your story of how you came to defending liberal values generally, but specifically being a leader on free speech.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm happy to be with you all. So I grew up in, as I would say, both a sort of a political liberal and a classical liberal. I supported reproductive rights and immigration and immigrant rights and civil liberties and the like. But I also was very much a classical liberal. I believed in my bones in free speech. I remember when I was 14 years old, my parents had me watch the movie Skokie with them, which was about the Nazis' march on Skokie. And my mom, who's a Jew from Baghdad, Iraq, was horrified that they would be able to march. And my dad, who was an American Jew and a civil libertarian, said, of course they have the right to march. If they can't march, then we don't really have freedom of speech in this country. Yeah. And I intuitively sided with my father. And I think I never budged from that position. I believe deeply in free speech. I think it's also a matter of personality. I like to argue. I like my speech to be heard. I wince when there are people who try to shut other people down or don't allow a conversation to happen. And everything that John Stuart Mill wrote resonates with me deeply. And again, partly because I cannot not speak up when I need to. And so when I've been in situations in my career or my life when I felt stifled, I felt like I couldn't, in a fundamental way, thrive. And so I always wanted to create cultures that supported people like me who had something to say and felt we needed to be heard, and also wanted to listen to a full range of opinions and sometimes felt we couldn't. And so back and around, I've been noticing what you might have earlier called political correctness for a long time. Even in college, I sort of winced when people tried to convince me that they had all the answers and that we shouldn't really talk about a set of issues. Early 2001, I wrote a memo to my colleagues at the organization I worked at, the American Jewish Committee, telling them that I was seeing disturbing signs of a narrative that was creeping into the civil rights community that I worked with, a narrative that characterized America as being fundamentally oppressive rather than a imperfect country aspiring to live up to its own ideals. And I warned them that ideology, it seemed to me, would be counter to the Jewish community's interests and counter to American society's interests. And so that's 20-some years ago. Yeah. I wrote about it again in 2003. In 2016, I wrote an op-ed piece that caused a lot of controversy in the Jewish world when I was in my first year at the job as CEO of this umbrella organization. And I warned that what's being called intersectionality is sort of this new ideological juggernaut that where various supposedly oppressed classes are working together toward a common oppressor. And I thought that was very dangerous. And then, of course, the George Floyd moment, even before that, I was already feeling like we were really entering a dark phase where you couldn't really argue back. And George Floyd moment hits, and And the Jewish community, which was typically a place where you could deliberate on complex issues, sometimes to a fault, you could debate until the wee hours of the night if there was a resolution before the organization, was shutting down discourse around complex ideas. And I thought, that's dangerous. In 2001, in February, I think I left my post there, and I immediately was looking for ways of doing liberalism. I did some work with Counterweight, and I helped found Institute for Liberal Values, and then started the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, really for two reasons. One was to fight against this sort of scourge of cancel culture, and to try to advocate for viewpoint diversity within the Jewish world, but also because I saw that if you're going to have an ideology that neatly divides the world into oppressed and oppressors, Jews are going to be lumped together with the oppressor class, and that was going to be dangerous for us.
Yeah.
And that's what, and so I wrote my book on really that latter phenomena, but to me, those two things are inseparable. We live in a society that doesn't allow people to talk to each other, that doesn't allow conversation, that stifles people who dissent, then that's not going to be a society where any group can thrive, including and maybe especially Jews. So that's sort of my origin story in all this.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I really appreciate that origin story. I'd love to even hear more about what you would say, for example, to people like your mother who don't understand, why we can't keep the Nazis from marching. Like, why would you say free speech is so important for everyone to have a thriving, flourishing society?
Yeah. Well, with anything, you need first principles, right? You need, and the first principle is got to be people have the basic right to, at least under the law, to speak their minds. And so then you have to apply that first principle in a way that sometimes may make you nauseated, as in allowing Nazis to march through a community with a lot of Holocaust survivors. I mean, I can't think of a more paradigmatic case. And that's why there were a lot of Jewish lawyers. The CEO of the ACLU at the time was Ira Glasser, who was Jewish. David Goldenberger was the attorney, the ACLU attorney who fought that way for free speech. So I think that that's incredibly important, and I would still stand with ACLU if it were the same organization. It is not, unfortunately.
Right. Key point there.
Today. And so, yes, that's why. And I think America, I remember I've been in, to Europe and Australia and other places where people have said, you Americans and your free speech, your First Amendment. And I'm reminded of that now as free speech is being attacked in Europe and is on the ropes in many of these countries, and how important it is and how well it's served us, and why I wish there was a global First Amendment. And I know some of my friends in Europe now have come around to our view of why we need a First Amendment. You don't want an arbitrary group of people deciding what constitutes free speech, what constitutes hate, what constitutes racism. A lot of times those arbitrary people are going to be 23-year-old Yale graduates who have a very specific idea of what's beyond the pale. And so I remind them of that, like, who are you going to empower to determine what is free speech? But free speech is not just, as we've seen, a legal protection. It's also a culture. Greg Luciano from FIRE has written about this, and I think it's a really important point that we want a culture that allows for maximum speech. Now, there are certain things that I think are beyond the pale of socially acceptable speech, but I want to minimize those things and have them a maximum Overton window. And and I think unfortunately that's the Overton window is closed some. I think it's being forced back open because I think we have gained a critical mass of people like ourselves who are fighting for it. But unfortunately, the anti-free speech forces and these ideologues have insinuated themselves in certain institutions. In those specific places, I don't think we've made any progress at all. I think that they doubled down on their ideological proclivities, and we now have to force it open in those institutions as well.
Well, it's fine. I was going to even ask you, given your long history and even noting or even sounding the alarm as you did back in 2001, whether you felt that kind of there has been positive progress or whether it's been continual decline. I mean, you noted the ACLU previously, and certainly, I've noted and many others that kind of they have probably the most prominent example of turning away from an organization that would still defend the Muskogee Marchers today, right? So I'm curious if you think we bottomed, or if you think it's still, at least among officialdom, still trending in the negative direction.
Yeah. So I think for a long time there was sort of a slow decline from, let's say, the late 1960s to 2000, maybe 22. It was the long march through institutions that went pretty much unabated.
Yeah.
But it became more aggressive in 2013, 2014, and it reached a fevered pitch in around 2020. And then there were people like us who pushed back against it.
Right.
And I think that pushback and this sort of pushback against DEI, which has taken hold, pushback against cancel culture, has at the highest levels made it harder for these forces to just shut down discourse. That said, and I call this a dual narrative. So in one sense, we've reached peak woke, if you will. In another sense, though, and in the institutions where these forces are most powerful, they've taken over, and I think they're doubling down. So K through 12 education, in medicine, in legal spheres, in theater and the arts and the like. These are places where I think that we are still losing and need to gain the upper hand. I think it's doable, but it's just going to take a lot longer, and it's going to require our own sort of reverse long march through institutions.
I was going to say it's a counter march in a way, or, well, it's kind of, we're all about the both and strategies or integrations at our organization. And, I see it as kind of both that, but also doing like what we're doing, which is starting and building new organizations that are rooted in these liberal values.
Yes.
That was certainly what motivated us to start 1776 Forward. And I think, and part of what motivated was this recognition, as you, I think, wonderfully stated, that it's not merely or only that you have the legal system to protect free speech rights, but that you have the culture of free speech. So that kind of maximum open forum for debate, even ideas that you might find offensive and loathsome, to us, that is still the ideal, the marketplace of ideas ideal to champion. So, and I think that can be perhaps as impactful. Maybe it will end up being more impactful in the long run than just simply trying to reverse the decline in the existing institutions.
Absolutely. Look, I think those two things, as you're saying, both and I think are really important. And I think sometimes people in our own camp get stated a little too adamantly that all of our institutions are far gone. We just got to throw the whole thing away. I don't think that that's true, and I don't think it's doable.
Right.
That said, I'm glad there are new institutions that are emerging, and I'm glad that there are also some counter trends within institutions that need to be that try to reclaim the platform. So at university level, for example, I'm glad there's the University of Austin, Texas. That's a great development. And I'm also glad that there are new centers of civic thought within certain universities that are a bastion of free expression of ideas and can stand as a counterpoint to what we've seen in the academy in recent decades.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and whether it's, obviously people have different views, but undoubtedly Elon's takeover of Twitter, and kind of, I guess you could say, wiping out a lot of those 23-year-old Yale grads who are making those, content and censoring decisions or the like. These are all, I think, steps to create kind of newer spaces or forums for a wider range of voices, and then let the marketplace decide where people want to go speak and listen.
I think
maybe shifting gears briefly, can you maybe just give us some sense of how you, as a leader in free speech and standing up for your ideas and values, how you prepare for either a talk like this, or a formal presentation, or just even putting yourself out there with other people in the public debate and kind of standing up and speaking out for your values?
Yeah. One thing about writing a lot, and I've written a lot, and I continue to write a lot, and writing a book, is that it's sort of it sort of instills these ideas, but also the words to express those ideas. And so I have now, more than I did when I first started this like 3 years ago, a rich vocabulary to describe what I'm trying to get across to audiences, because I've done a lot of podcasts like this and I've talked to a lot of people, and it becomes easier and easier to get those ideas out at my sort of mental fingertips, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't do a ton of preparation anymore. I don't, you know, I still, there are times when I do, when I feel like, okay, I'm venturing into new territory. So I recently had to give a presentation on the long march through institutions and why we're at where we're at. And I developed an infographic that had various points in time, starting in like the mid 1950s to the late 1960s, to the various points where we saw this ideology gain ground. And I hadn't really done that kind of detailed tour through the ideology through the ages up until the present moment. And so having to go through that, write it down, create the infographic, then helped me express it more readily when it came to that time. But in general, look, I'm trying to create a movement of people who maybe are in the center left to center right, the 30-yard line to 30-yard line, who stand up for these fundamental values in our society and are willing to push back. One of the obstacles sometimes as I get is that free speechers tend to be loners and purists. And so they don't like to work in coalition. They don't like to have to, you know, to be in coalition with people who sometimes spout off in ways that maybe they shouldn't, or maybe get a little too ideological themselves and the like. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have to navigate, is that there has to be a politics of free speech. And that's challenging, because if you think about it, politics itself is an inherently political thing. In other words, it means that you're going to say certain things and not say certain things.
Right.
And that seems to violate the very precepts of free speech. Like, and so are we going to play politics in order to try to restore some level of sanity in our institutions? And if so, does that mean we're going to play hardball with people who disagree with us? And you can see where the tension is in all of that. And I think that there's no escaping that paradox. I think politics is inherently illiberal in some basic way. So, for example, if you're a major lobby group, okay, let's say you're the AARP, the Senior Citizens Lobby Group, a juggernaut of a lobby organization, and you want to preserve Social Security benefits and the like. Now, if a member of Congress who isn't where you are, wants to entertain the possibility of cutting Social Security benefits, AARP is not going to be liberal. They are going to exercise all the power that they have to shut that member of Congress down. Now, that is politics. That is the way the political game is played. But if AARP goes to the next step and tries to stop us from having this podcast where we disagree with them, or they try to prevent a community forum from happening, that rather than just punishing a member of Congress who, then I think then you can say that they're acting in an illiberal way.
Yeah.
And so I think we've got to learn to navigate that power politics are part of our reality and cannot be subject to the same rules of liberalism. And we have to play that. At the same time, carve out space in society where people can genuinely express their views, immune from those political pressures that I talked about.
Yeah. Well, you as you kind of said, politics is certainly coalition building, and it's something Joy and I both have thought a lot about when we try to organize our activities, which is, you said it kind of at the outset of this portion of how do you organize a group of individuals. And for us, we actually return back to that kind of both and framing of kind of different paradoxes or polarities of identity, that we are individuals, but we are also the most social of creatures, right? And so, recognizing both aspects and then trying to appeal to people's sense of building a coalition in order to preserve your values, particularly liberal values, is a critical part of the process of civic participation. So definitely have our work cut out for us.
Yes.
Amongst our own crowd of them helping
It's
see that.
herding cats. Herding cats.
Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
since they are the animal du jour right now.
Yes,
So,
that is true. Right.
uh, yeah. Um, really quickly, one question we love with all of our guests before we run out of time is just if you had kind of all the money and time in the world, like what is the primary project you would invest in that you think would be most impactful for advancing either the legal framework or the cultural, but probably the cultural, you know, environment for free speech?
Yeah, man, that's a hard one because I think I have a pretty rich menu of possibilities in my mind. But I'd have to say K through 12 education really
Mm,
scares the Jesus out of me. I'm my organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, is almost entirely pivoting to K through 12 education because we think that that really is sort uh, of central importance to our future in this country. If it's one thing when Brown University becomes illiberal, that affects a small percentage of people,
right.
important segment. But if the entire K through 12 system is taken over by ideologues, and I think I don't want to overstate it because it's not everywhere equally, but major swaths of it are taken
Yeah.
over by ideologues, we end up with a very skewed discourse. We end up with young people who don't even know what liberalism is,
Right.
don't even have a language for the free expression of ideas. And I think we've got to fight back hard in K through 12 education and start to reverse this long march ourselves by creating new efforts of teacher training. I mean, the teachers' colleges have been captured, the
Yeah.
teachers' unions have been captured. So how do we then reverse course? Well, we've got to do the short run stuff, which is to fight back when it emerges, but the long run stuff, which is to train teachers in this alternative model and to return to critical thinking and free inquiry and the like. And I think we've got a work cut out for us because we're really, really far behind in that realm. So yeah,
Mm,
you give me an unlimited budget and say I have to invest in one area. Well, one, my organization's in it, but two, that's where I think the most damage is being done.
yeah. Well, and obviously the bulk of that is right, the public school system, which is a political challenge to your earlier point, right?
Yes,
But there's
absolutely.
obviously alternatives growing and emerging, kind of alternatives to the public school system. So yet again, it's probably a both and strategy there in terms of the mediums through which the education
Yep.
is being given.
Yeah. There's so many things that need to be done in these realms. And our industry, if you will, is in its infancy, and we need to develop it and have it mature if we're going to start to rack up the victories. I hope we
Yeah,
will.
for sure. Well, there's definitely a theme on this question with you and other guests about education and particularly earlier education. So I take some comfort that people see the problem and I think might even be identifying some of the root sources of it. And like you, glad to hear just turning their attention to hoping to fix it.
Well, I'm glad I have people like you to work with. So thanks
Yeah.
very much.
Well, that perfectly takes us to our time. So thank you. I think we lost Joya due to technical difficulties, but we thank you for your time. And as a reminder to all of our listeners, we drop a new episode every 2 weeks on Tuesday. So look out for the next one 2 weeks from now. And as ever, you can find us on ILV's YouTube station under the Dissidents podcast, also Apple and Spotify podcasts under ILV's Dissidents station. You can also go to their website, ilvalues.org, and David's organization, jilv.org, and 1776forward.com for yours truly. Thanks. See you again in 2 weeks. Thanks, David.
Thanks a million.